Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to our GFDRR Disaster, Fragility, Conflict, Violence Nexus platform. We are honored to have Tobias, Senior Lecturer at Murdoch University and full professor at Hiroshima University, and author of the insightful and very timely book, Catastrophes, Confrontations, and Constraints, How Disasters Shape the Dynamics of Armed Conflicts, with us today. First of all, Tobias, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write this book.
The main introduction for the book is that with climate change, with urbanization, with people moving into more vulnerable areas like floodplains or steep slopes, and with persistent inequality and poverty, we will see an increasing both frequency and intensity of disaster events over the next decades. That's a trend that's already visible. So as a social science researcher or as a conflict researcher, one of the big questions I was asking myself are what are the implications of these changes, this increase in disasters for conflict dynamics and for conflict risks? And that motivated me to do the research.
What would you say would be the main findings and insights that you would want to share?
Disasters are rarely, if at all, the main drivers of conflict risks. It's usually political or economic factors, but that disasters in quite a few cases, in a significant amount of cases, shape the dynamics, the intensity of ongoing conflicts, the intensity of fighting. And especially in places or in situations where there is a high vulnerability to disasters and where the disaster benefits one of the conflict parties, more commonly the rebel group. For instance, because they can recruit deprived survivors or the state is busy with the disaster response. In those contexts, we see disasters increasing the risk of conflict intensity, and we see usually fighting escalates. Disasters actually decrease fighting intensity in the 6 to 12 months after a disaster. And that's because, for instance, it is hard to move troops around if infrastructure has been destroyed by the disaster, or because both the government and the rebels are busy by the disaster response.
Have you come across indications of exactly how the conflict has made the recovery from disasters more complicated?
The first one being usually that not in all cases the government is very willing to grant international relief providers access to the areas. Think of Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar in 2008, where the government was really reluctant to let international relief and support in, even so there was massive destruction that overwhelmed local authorities. Even if the government grants access, there might be insecurity issues, like in the Philippines, where rebel groups have repeatedly attacked aid convoys, or in Somalia, where the same happened. And then obviously the question is, first of all, does the aid go to the people affected by the disaster, or is it looted by the rebel groups? But also, obviously, once there is that much insecurity on the ground, that also makes international responders or NGOs or governments more cautious in moving in and providing large amounts of aid.
But do you think, in theory, does this really open the door to undertaking more conflict-sensitive disaster risk management, perhaps even disaster risk reduction, and perhaps also a disaster risk management initiative that can specifically seek to improve the conditions for peace?
Usually it's politically not very popular to invest in disaster risk reduction, particularly not in conflict-sensitive disaster risk reduction, because it's long-term, it's not very visible. But if you can show that actually disaster vulnerability has impacts, not just in terms of human security, disaster prevention, but also in terms of more classical national security issues, that might be a point to rally additional support or to convince policymakers to put effort into that. And then, if a disaster hits a conflict area and it weakens both conflict parties, it affects them negatively, chances of peace negotiations to be successful are much larger because peace spoilers are also less active, which means that negotiators, diplomats, peace builders can also scale up their efforts to negotiate an agreement after these kinds of disasters.
Thank you, Tobias. We're reaching the end of our interview. I feel like I could have gone for another hour, but if there's one message to keep in mind, that investing in disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction is never a wasted cause. And thanks again so much, Tobias, for joining us. Have a good day, everybody.